Hi, everyone. My name is Vincent Warmerdam, and I am a research advocate at Rasa. What we do is we make open source software to make virtual assistants. And what I would like to do today is just explain to you what the merits of that system are, and also just the basics of how it works. Now, to do that, there's one thing that we will need to do, and that is that we will have to install Rasa first. The way that you do that is you have to go to a terminal. Here's mine. I'm using Visual Studio Code for this. And what I've got activated here is a virtual environment. Inside this virtual environment, you are able to pip install Rasa, and that should go ahead and install everything. But usually it's a pretty good idea to make sure we've all got the correct Rasa version. So if you're going to install Rasa, just to make sure that we're all using the same features, I would recommend installing Rasa version 2.2.7. That's the version that I'll be using today, at least. And again, you should be able to, if you're in a virtual environment, type you should be able to just pip install Rasa, and this should install everything that you need. Now, while this is installing, I'm assuming that a lot of you are now running these install commands, but while these, yes, just make the window a bit bigger. So again, to install this, you just need to run this pip install Rasa command, but this command can really take a while. So what I would like to do is just give a little bit of background on what Rasa is all about, and then also explain how the system's going to work. And then by the time I'm done with that explanation, I think it's safe to say that this install command will be done, and we can move on to actually implement the system. And the feedback so far suggests that we're all doing well, which is great. Yes, so let me now grab the screen from Google Slides. And yes, let's move that in here. There we go. And let's present this. So what we will be doing today is we are going to make a chatbot from the command line. So that means that we will be talking to the command line as an interface, and we will be using open source tools for that. And in particular, we will be using Rasa. Now, there's a couple of things that Rasa does, but at least mentally, the first step to be aware of, something that we want to have in our system is we want to have a system where there's one user over here, and that's talking to a virtual assistant, which is depicted here by this little robot. And let's say that we're interested in making a system that can be used to order pizzas. Then a conversation might happen like, hello. We get a response that says hi. The user then might say that the user wants to buy a pizza. The response might be what kind. Then it might be that we are asking ourselves like, hey, by the way, are you a human? And then we would like to get a response saying something like, hey, no, I'm not a human, I'm a bot, but what kind of pizza would you like? If you look at a conversation like this, there's a couple of things that you can recognize that are happening in this conversation. So at every step, whenever there's a user that is saying something, you could argue that that user at that point in time has a specific intent. So in the beginning here, when the user is saying hello, we could argue that the intent is to make a greeting. And then what we would like is that the system is not just able to pick up on this intent, but given this intent is also able to give the right action to follow. And it's not just intents that we might want to retrieve from the conversation that we might want to do something with. It might also be that we're interested in grabbing specific entities that are of interest to us. In this particular case, we might be able to assume that at this establishment you can buy a pizza, but you might also be able to buy other products. And the products that you're able to buy, well, that can be an entity that you're trying to detect. In the case of a food place, food would be a common entity. If we were making a digital assistant where You might be able to book a flight. Then you can imagine that the city or airport that you're interested in flying to, that might be an entity. But I hope it's clear that we're not just interested in these intents. We are certainly also interested in all of these separate entities, so to say. Now, these intents and these entities, they're great. They're useful building blocks for an assistant. But the hard part usually isn't so much detecting those. The much harder part is detecting the right action. And in this small conversation, I hope that you can kind of see why. Something that might happen in a conversation is that we are entering a certain flow, or like the happy path. Like we have a happy path that the user here might want to buy a pizza. But maybe the path gets interrupted. After all, the user might in between have this by the way moment and ask us whether or not it's speaking to a human. And in this case, ethically, I would argue the assistant should never pretend to be a human. So it's ethically important that we give this response. But immediately after that, we should also follow back up on the conversation that we were having. We need to be able to recover as well. So the idea behind Rasa is that as far as the machine learning goes, we have an open source system with tools that will help you detect these intents, these entities, and we also have machine learning models that can predict the next action to take. We have all sorts of systems at your disposal that you can just go ahead and experiment with. We also allow you to come up with your own ways of, finding intents, entities, and actions. That's especially relevant if you are working on an assistant that it might need to be not just English, but a whole bunch of languages. I have a lot of open source tools, but I can definitely imagine that someone from the Philippines understands the Filipino language way better than I ever will. So the idea with open source here is also that you can customize all of these components. And Rasa doesn't just solve this machine learning problem over here. We also have tools such that you can integrate with Facebook Messenger, with WhatsApp, and all of these places where you might want to have an assistant. So on a high level, this is what Rasa offers, and this is also what we're going to do today. We're going to be making small demo conversations, and we're going to configure an assistant that's able to handle a basic conversation. And I'm responding now. This is a good. If you have questions, this is an excellent point in time to ask them. I think Miguel has a pretty good response. Miguel is saying, well, from the ethics point of view, it would be better even if we have an assistant over here that before even starting the conversation makes it clear that the assistant is virtual and not an actual human. So something like, I'm a bot, how can I help? I certainly agree that that's a very fair way to start the conversation. That's definitely a good practice. Having said that, though, I do think that it's still, even if we start a conversation this way, still a good practice to be able to answer this question should it appear later in the conversation. But Miguel's comment here certainly is fair. The way that you start a conversation, that's also something that you have control over, and it should at every point in time at least be clear that the user's not talking to an actual human being. There's also someone asking about whether or not I can make the code window larger. I am not 100% sure if I have control over that. I'll try this other button and we will see if that helps. I just clicked it. But just to check, are there no more questions from people? There are some questions about how to hold state variables in a conversation. I will briefly talk about that. The idea is that these entities that you've seen here, as far as the conversation is concerned, you could say, well, this is an entity and it only exists in this utterance. But you can also configure Rasa in such a way that whenever an entity as like this one appears in a form, that it's stored in memory and that we keep it around for the long term. That's definitely something that we can do. Another question is, does Rasa give capabilities to hold a natural language conversation? Yes and no. It sort of depends on what you mean by that. We have a sort of very new end-to-end system that's an experimental feature that we've recently released. But in general, we don't use techniques like GPT-3 or anything like that to generate responses. Besides the ethical concerns, we've also found that a lot of our clients aren't necessarily interested in that, for the main reason that you typically want to have tight control over what you communicate to your users. And having a generative algorithm in that sense is a risk factor. Another way of sort of thinking about this is that we offer you Lego bricks to construct a conversation. Okay, so having said that, you might wonder, given that we're going to be doing conversations like this one, like how do you configure that? Do I need to do all of this stuff with programming? And the answer is, well, no, you don't have to do everything with code. Instead, what Rasa offers is we basically give you this configuration system. So instead of programming everything in a programming language, what we do is we say, well, you can probably configure an assistant better instead of programming it. So there's a couple of files that we're going to see that are going to be very important. In particular, we've got our data files. And one of the data files that we are going to be discussing is the NLU.yaml file. That stands for Natural Language Understanding. And the idea behind that file is that you get to define Lego bricks in a conversation as far as intents go. So I've got some examples of what you might expect in an NLU.yaml file. It's a YAML file, so it's a hierarchical structure. But inside of this NLU tree, we have an intent of greet, followed by all sorts of examples over here. And these are just all sorts of different ways to say hello to an assistant. And the idea is that this is going to be input for a machine learning algorithm, such that the machine learning algorithm can learn, if I see something that's similar to good morning or good evening or hey dude, that can be interpreted as the intent greet. It is the job of the machine learning algorithm to generalize beyond just detecting these separate words, of course. Like we don't want to do like a proper matching in order to figure out that this is the right intent, but we can see this as training data. And you see here that we have the same thing for goodbye. And also another set for affirming and for denying something in a conversation. But the idea with this NLU.yaml file is that we can say, well, that contains all of our intents with examples. I'm going to finish up these couple of slides first, and then there's a couple of questions coming in now. So I'll do the slides first, but I'll come back to all of the questions after. Now, the idea is that given this NLU.yaml file, we have these building blocks, if you will. It's kind of like a Lego brick. And you could say something like in a line of, well, we're able to greet, we're able to say goodbye, and you might be able to see that as a Lego brick to construct a conversation. So you then have to introduce this other sort of topic, or this construct, namely the conversation itself typically follows in a story. Because these intents, they live in the context of a story if you think about it. And basically what you can define in your stories like YAML file are just paths in a conversation. Now, the assistant that we'll be making is called MoodBot. It's kind of a hello world application. And the idea of the bot is that we say hello, and then we check if you're happy or sad. And if you're sad, we try to cheer you up. So the way the conversation could go is that we greet, and then we have an action, namely that we say hello back. And if then you declare that you're unhappy, then we would like these two actions to follow. We try to cheer you up, and then we check whether or not that helped. And if you then say yes, then we again have the correct response. Again, we can look at this as training data for machine learning algorithms. We have examples of stories that happened in the past, and we would like algorithms to learn the pattern that's underneath here. That said, sometimes it's great to have a story that defines something, but at other times, you can also imagine that it's much easier to use a rule. Whenever we see the intent bot challenge, that is the intent that says, hey, are you a bot or not? Then it doesn't really matter where in the conversation you are. We should always get this utterance back. So sometimes we can define the way that the conversation needs to be handled in a story, but we should remember that a story is dependent on when something is happening in the conversation. If we know for sure that there's always one and only one response for a certain intent, then it might just be more pragmatic to have it in there as a rule. And things like saying goodbye and things like, hey, are you a bot or not? Like those are typical things that you can expect for rules. Finally, and I'm not going to go too much in depth on this topic, but it's good to know that it's around. We have all of our data files that we just mentioned, but then we also need a file that defines our machine learning pipeline. And there's lots of fancy machine learning stuff to be said about this. We have a fancy diet classifier at our disposal. We have policy models that will try to predict the next action in the story. We have featureizers at our disposal. We can do word embeddings here if we're interested. Everything that you see here is a Python class, which means that if you're interested in building your own component, you can totally do so. But for today's session, we're not going to be changing this too much. The one thing that is good to be aware of, though, is that you can fully customize this to your liking. And if you want to add tools, say tools for non-English languages, then you can totally do that here as well. That's the great thing about open source. You can just tweak whatever you feel like. So those are the files that we'll be using to build a system like this one. So after this, what I would like to do is actually go back to my coding environment and start programming some Rasa. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code over here so people can see the install commands just again. But what I will do now in the meantime is answer a couple of questions because a lot of people have been asking away. So I'll try to answer some questions first. So the first question is, it works. That's great. How to suggest the user something dynamically with the help of slots and entities. So we have the actions that we have inside of Rasa here. I'll show you an example in a bit. But the action that we have here, that could be just a template, like just some text you send back to the user. But an action here could also be some custom Python code that communicates with a database before sending something back to the end user. So if anything custom you want to send to the user, if Python can generate it, you can send it to your user. So custom actions would be the most general solution for that. Other than generating responses, do you have any kind of syntax to do NLP in the outputs? Thorben, if you could rephrase that question, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. Kai is asking, how do you evaluate which questions a chatbot may expect to respond to? Usually, you know what type of action you would like to offer. So Kai, the question to that, so the answer to that question is, you usually, if you're building an assistant, you start from scratch. So you just come up with a couple of intents that sound reasonable. And then you show it to a couple of your colleagues. They give feedback on it. Typically, you learn a little bit from that. You add a couple of intents and you add some examples. And then you show it to like a really small subset of your users. And you learn from that. And as you learn, your assistant gets better. And then you show it to more and more and more users. And that's the most common flow that we see. We certainly acknowledge that you cannot predict the way that users are going to interact with your assistant up front. So you're going to have to be very pragmatic about it. I'll show you at the end that we've also made a tool called Rasa X to sort of help you in the sharing it with users and labeling part. Yes, back to the code. Is there a library, for example, intents entities available from other Rasa users? Yes, so we have a Rasa NLU data examples repository on GitHub. I might have the name wrong. But the idea is that we do offer data sets that should help you get started. There's like some banking examples, some customer service examples, chit chat. There's a bunch of things that you could start with. Oh yeah, you're right. My face is currently obscuring. Let's click a button. Hopefully this is better. Torben, good comment. It's an interesting interface, but I think in a moment you should see my face go down. We'll see if that helps, but good comment. Let me know if it doesn't get any better. What's the average number of examples for each intent? I don't have a hard figure for that, but let's start around 10 just as a starting point. But 5 definitely is like a good minimum. If people could respond to let me know if, like, as far as the viewport is concerned, this is better than what we had before, like if this is big enough text. And any best practice tips on how to write the examples for variation? The best examples typically come from end users. So my best advice is show it to people show this to people and look what their first text is that they're giving to your assistant. Usually those are the best training labels ever. Can there be multiple responses defined? Yes. So you can have the custom action, but you can also say, well, I have 3 variations of a single response that I send back to the user. So that's also something that we can play with. Is one intent used as a synonym for one dialogue turn? The short answer there is not really. I have to get quite technical, but I might get in that at the end. And someone is saying that they got an error. Feel free to... So if for the people who are getting an error, one thing to maybe pay attention to, if you could pip install Rasa double equals and make sure that you're installing this specific version, 2.2.7. Once you've got this, then everything should be fine, like fingers crossed, of course, on all the different platforms. But again, it's 2.2.7 that I will be using. And Rasa X is something that I'll explain more at the end of today's session. Anyway, I'm now ready to sort of do the cool thing and actually play around with Rasa. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a folder here called blank slate. That'll just be my blank slate that I get to start from. As you can see, this folder is empty. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to go and type Rasa init. So this init command is going to start a new assistant for us and all the files that you need to get started. It takes a while to boot up, but you should see a prompt that kind of looks like this. So it's asking, hey, please confirm the path where you would like this project to be created. And I'm saying the current directory, yep, that's fine, let's do that. So now we see that in this blank slate folder, suddenly there's all these YAML files that have been added. There's data and there's actions and all the good stuff. It's asking if I want to train an initial model, and I'm going to say yes to that. And what this will now do is we are going to be training our first machine learning models. Again, this is something that's going to take a while. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this a slightly smaller window, put it to the side just for now. And instead, what I would like to do is just explore the data files that I've got inside here. And in particular, the files that I'll be exploring are, so you've got the root folder called blank slate. And inside of that, there's a data folder. And nlu.yaml is a file, rules.yaml, and stories. We're just going to have a look at what's in those. Yes. If people are having installation issues, I think most of them are gone. But if you just want to follow along to learn, that's also fine. Know that you can always approach me on Twitter, and I can always give you the links on any installation videos that we have. Our YouTube channel has a lot of tutorials out there. Anyway, let's just check out these files now. So in our nlu.yaml file, we have our intents and our examples. So what we saw on the slides as well. So we've got this greeting here, for example, with what are all the different ways that you can do a greeting? Well, and then there's a long list here. And the same thing for goodbye, same thing for saying yes or affirming, denying. There's also another one for telling you that your mood is great. You can say that you're great, you're feeling like a king. There's a couple of examples here. There's also an intent that tells you that you're unhappy. And there is the intent, which doesn't have a whole lot of examples yet, on challenging the assistant, like asking whether or not you're a bot or you're a human. Now, if you pay attention to the names of these intents, you will notice that they also make an appearance in the stories.yaml file. So we can say, hey, there's a greeting. And if the story starts with a greeting like so, then the next thing that we should do is we should utter greet back. That's an action that we should take. Just checking if people are asking questions. Doesn't look like it, so that's good. Hopefully people are following along. And after this happens, there's another thing that we can do. We can say, well, we have a great mood, and then we should get this utter happy back. And we also have these rules that we talked about earlier. But this is the basic setup for the stories. Now, what we can do now, and I'll just close the put the bar there on the side. But if everything went well, then you should notice that your machine learning model is done training. It's a relatively small data set, so this should be enough. And you should now see the prompt if you would like to speak to the assistant on the command line. So I'm going to say yes to that. And by the way, what just happened is we trained a machine learning model. And if you go to the models folder, you should now see that a zipped file has appeared that contains the machine learning model that we've just trained, by the way. But anyway, let's try this out. So let's say hello to the assistant. It says, hey, how are you? And I can say, I am great. And it says, great, carry on. So I'm just going to grab the story for this path real quick. But this is the conversation that I just had. And if I compare it to the story, like, it really fits this happy path over here, right? Like I'm greeting, and apparently I'm getting some sort of a response back that's saying utter greet. And apparently it's detecting here the intent that I'm feeling great. And then I'm getting this response saying utter happy. So I hope that we can sort of see where the patterns come from. But what you're probably wondering now is where this utter greet comes from, because we know everything about what we're putting into the system. But you might be wondering, well, how does the assistant know what to respond here? Also, feel free at this point in time to ask questions. But if you're interested in knowing where this utter response is defined and where it comes from, you need to look into this other YAML file that we haven't discussed yet. Now, again, blank slate is the root directory of my project. All the files that I've opened so far are in this data folder. And now I'm going to open up this domain.yaml file because it's in this file where these actions are defined. There's a few things defined in here, though. Like one way of looking at your domain.yaml file, it's sort of the file where most things come together. And one of the things that you see defined here are all the intents that we're using in our assistant. But what you can also see here are all the responses. And I hope that you indeed recognize that, hey, how are you? That is uttered as a greeting action, which is also what we saw here. And I hope that you recognize that the name utter greet here also corresponds with our stories file here. So that's how these things are linked. We have intents that are used in a story, and those are found in our NLU.yaml file with examples. And our actions, those are typically defined in our domain.yaml file. So this will be a great time to ask questions. What we're going to do after this is, after I get some questions and I answer them, but what we're going to do after is we are going to try to see if we can fool this assistant, because this assistant is by no means perfect. And I always like to show that assistants aren't perfect. So by breaking an assistant, we also get this opportunity to fix it. And it's fairly easy to cause that to happen. Just to check. Sat path is no negation. We can explain that in a moment as well. So I'll give it a couple more seconds just to check if there are no questions. Okay. So Mara is asking the question, are the chatbot's utterances always handwritten? Typically, yes, they are. Theoretically, you can use natural language generation inside of a custom action, but we do urge people to be very, very careful with that. In general, those algorithms cannot always be trusted because they have been known to generate bigotry as well, which is something you don't want to have happen inside of your assistant. What you can do, though, is add some variations to things. And we might certainly see an example of that. Okay, but I think we're good on... oh, a bunch of questions suddenly come in. So at the moment, we are not using transformers in our pipeline. We could, though. So if you go to the config.yaml file, you will see the basic configuration. Currently, it's not configured to use transformers, but you can certainly do that inside of Rasa. A lot of people do. And I agree, if you're interested in a good example, not to do natural language generation, Google the chatbot that Microsoft made on Twitter. It's a good example of what might go wrong. One final question. If I look at the story, I see a second intent that may not happen, as it is only happening when the human is generating mood grade intent. What happens if the human enters something different? That's a great question. Let's see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do \restart, which is a way for us to say, well, let's restart this this assistant. And what I'm going to do now, just to show, like, I can say hello there. And then we see that we apparently have the intent hello, and I'm getting the correct response, like, hey, how are you? But what if I restart this now, and instead of saying hello, I'm going to be a little bit less formal, and I'm going to just type yo. And now we see that something is up. Something is not really going well here. It seems to be confused. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to poke the model a little bit. I'm going to try to see if I can show you what exactly the model is thinking at this stage. To properly do that, I'm going to hit Control-C to exit the shell over here. And instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a different interactive command, namely Rasa interactive. The idea with this command is it's like the Rasa shell. We just still get to talk to our assistant. But the main thing that is different is that we get a little bit more feedback on what's happening. So you can kind of do some debugging and labeling, actually, as you're talking to your assistant. So let's start the conversation by just typing yo, again, which is something probably that the assistant hasn't seen at all yet. It's like it's not in the training examples. If I now type yo, then the model is telling me what it thinks. It's saying that the NLU model classified yo with the intent affirm, and that there are no entities. And we are also given the opportunity to say whether or not this is correct. And in this case, I feel very certain that this is not correct. What we do get, though, is this sign of confidence, what the model thinks that this might be. And in this particular case, I'm also able to make this correction. So I'm able to say, look, that word yo is probably unlike something you've seen before, but it's definitely a way of greeting. So I can just say, hey, let's do that. Next, I'm also being prompted to sort of ask, I'm prompted to check whether or not there are any entities in here, and there aren't any, so I'll just hit enter again. And now we can see the chat history that has happened. And now we get to see that the assistant thinks utter greet is the right thing to do, so I can say yes. It says, hey, how are you? And then it wants to listen again. Again, that's correct. And now we get to move a bit further as well. So now what we can do is we can try to maybe trigger a path like this one, just to see what would happen, right? So it's asking me, hey, how are you? And let's say something like, I am super duper sad. Well, let's spell it correctly for now. And now it's saying that I'm super duper sad is with intent unhappy. Okay, that also seems fine. I think I'll just hit yes here. Now the model wants to run cheer up, which is correct. I'm given a link, but feel free to open it. It's a pretty picture of a pretty lion trying to maybe cheer you up. And then you can utter, hey, did that help? And then is that correct or not? And I can say yes. Action listen, okay. So one thing I can do now is I can say, well, what would happen if I don't use affirm or deny here? Like, what might happen if I do that? And in this case, I kind of want to just check what happens if I were to say, well, are you a bot? Right? That's something that's not defined in any of these stories. But in this case, it is still able to predict the correct action. And the reason is that even if something doesn't appear in a story, we might still have a rule for it. So if you go to the rules at YAML, you might remember that whenever we see this intent, we said that this is the only correct response. Well, that's something where rules can definitely help you. It won't be perfect because you won't be able to fix everything with rules, of course. But the idea is that there are ways to handle the conversation, even if you don't have a perfect story for every single situation. Note that if we don't have rules here and we would still fill in something here, that there would be a machine learning model trying to make the right decision. And one thing that you can have as a configuration is that if the models are uncertain, that we ask the user, hey, we didn't quite get that. Could you rephrase the question? Those are things that we can do. Now, just to show, right, like one pretty nifty feature about this Rasa interactive is that if I were to press Control-C now to sort of exit this environment, that I can say, hey, don't just quit, but also export everything that I've just typed. This way, if you found some mistakes in your assistant, you're able to add extra data to your training files. So I'm saying, yes, please change all of these files. And you should now notice that just by doing this little exercise, we now have this interactive story that appeared, and that the story that's in here is the story that we just saw happen below. You should also be able to confirm, if you go to your nlu.yaml file, that now yo is an actual example that we're using in the greet intent over here. Now, the idea is that I have a better data set. So that means that if I were to retrain a model, the model will also be better. And this is kind of the iterative way to make your assistant better and better over time. So quick demo there. This will be an excellent point in time to ask questions. Someone is asking if Rasa has its own transformers. I mean, technically, yes, I have trained my own transformer models before. But most of our users prefer to use transformers that are trained on bigger data sets. So that's what we just offer. You can just use a transformer from Hugging Face or whatever vendor, really. And people like to plug and play those. That's what we usually see. So there's a question here about working with rules only. And the thing with rules is they don't solve everything. And there's actually an example that I can give here. It's a good question, though. So let's go to our stories file here. The thing is, if I look at this rule, then I hope you would agree that here I am saying that if there's a bot challenge, then this is the only correct response. But that's because we have a very one-to-one mapping to the intent and the action over here, which we don't always have. It's not always a very clear one-to-one mapping. If you have a look at the story, for example, if affirm is happening after these two actions, then we should say, you're probably happy. And if we say deny after these two actions, yeah, well, then we should probably say goodbye. I hope you can imagine, though, that what you should do after affirming, that really depends on all the other things that happen in the conversation. That's not really a one-to-one mapping from the intent in affirm to utter happy. Especially with more complex assistants, and especially when these stories get a little bit longer, I hope you recognize that, maybe we need something besides just rules, because if we were to solve this with rules, I mean, you would need to have a rule that says if we start with greeting and then this is the action and then you're unhappy and then we have these two actions and then you do affirm, then this is the correct response. But maintaining all of those rules to that extent is going to be painful and infeasible. So in Rasa, we also have a mechanism that prevents you from writing very complex rules. But this is also the reason. It's predicting the next action is more than just looking at the previous intent in general. Okay, so this is the base demo. And what I'm just going to go ahead and do is see how much more time we've got. And then I would kind of leave it, I would like to leave it up to the crowd to determine what we're going to do next. So one thing that I might be able to show off is Rasa X, and I think that's pretty fun to actually just briefly show. Let me just check the time here. To this workshop we have. We've got plenty of time. Okay, now we've got plenty of time. Okay, so just to check, any questions on this? Just type something real quick. So for those of you who want to follow along, and again, assuming that I'm waiting for questions and I'll answer some of them. But if you're interested in having a feel for what Rasa X might be, I'm going to just briefly show a tool real quick called Rasa X. And if you want to play with that, I'll just give you the install command in chat. What this pip install command is doing is we are installing Rasa X. And what we are also doing is we are downloading that from Rasa's private pip server. This is not a public package. It's something that we host ourselves. And you can find it here. But you do need to add this install link if you want to go ahead and install it. It's something that I've already installed. So I'm just going to run Rasa X real quick to give you a demo of what it is and what it can do. Because especially if you're making more complex agents, you need more than just a machine learning tool. You need a tool that's able to help you in maintaining data quality, which is something that I just want to give a small preview of. We're gonna go back to coding in a bit, but I do want to just quickly show you what Rasa X might be able to do for you. Okay, that's open now in this tab. So that should be good. And if I go to models now, we see a model there. Okay, good. So what you're looking at here is just a browser window. So this is a web app. It's a server that I'm running locally, and this is a web app effectively. And I'm running it locally. But this app allows me to do more things than what I'm able to do from the shell. Oh, wait, people are asking questions. Into config, all the different modules. Yeah, I can show a form. Yeah, okay. I think I see some stuff. I'll show you a form, which is a way of yeah, I'll show you a form. We're going to ask for a user's name, and then we're going to try to store that. I think that might be a cool demo. One thing about this, though, we're going to go back to talking on the command line because that's just useful. But one thing that is also nice to know is I can also just have a web app where I can talk to an assistant. And, you know, I can say, hello, how are you? I can say, I am super sad, like before. And then we're going to see like, hey, here's a picture of a lion. Did that help you? And I can say, yes. You say goodbye. So like, one thing that's nice is this is a web experience. So we have like richer things that we're able to play with. Like we can actually see the images here. And you can also imagine that we're able to render buttons here as well. So you can say yes or no. So that already is pretty sweet. But another thing that is really, really cool about this is that we can also do all of our labeling here. Just hit refresh there. So if we ever type something that we've never seen before, then automatically we can say like, hey, can you just confirm that this is the correct intent? And I can say, oh yeah, there you go. Another thing that we can do is from here, we can also retrain our models if we are so interested. And we can also have a look at all of our NLU data. But another thing that's really cool about Rasa X, and that's just the main thing that you got to remember, is there's a button over here that allows you to share a link with a potential user. That can be a colleague, but you can also host this web app somewhere live. And this is a way for you to share this assistant with actual other people. And that means that you can kind of get training data from people who are interacting with your assistant as they naturally would. They don't have to sit behind a terminal on your laptop in order for you to collect training data. You can just present this very simple web app, and you can already get more meaningful training data than data that you yourself came up with. So if I were now to say like, hey, how are you? I am fantastic, my friend. Like that's something it's probably never seen before. And it's indeed confused. Like, I am fantastic, my friend. That it probably didn't pick up the word fantastic here. So it's doing the wrong thing here. So I can say something like, no, that's totally wrong. And that's probably going to be confused here as well. But all these examples in this view that I've just generated should now also appear in my NLU inbox, which means that I can actually label from data that my colleagues are generating on my behalf, or maybe some of my first users. And that is super, super useful in the long run. This is like a core lesson that I do want to sort of emphasize, because you can kind of draw this up as sort of a Venn diagram, if you will. And it's a thing that I see go wrong in many machine learning projects. Because on one end, you've kind of got the stuff that we try to optimize, right? And on this other end of the Venn diagram, we have the stuff that our users like, or stuff that our users care about, I should say. And the danger whenever you're doing machine learning is that the overlap between what you're optimizing and what the users actually care about, that's not always that big. Our users aren't going to care about great summary statistics of our machine learning models. They also won't care about any of our benchmarks, but they will really care about having an assistant that will actually help them. You can have a great grid search, but if there are intents missing that your users are asking for, it doesn't really make sense to focus on the machine learning part just yet. So in order to help you prevent this issue, just remember the best thing that you can do is to maybe use something like Rasa X to get data from your first users via something like this. This is everything I just quickly wanted to show about Rasa X, though, because what I would like to do now is just move back to Rasa and show you some of the more interesting features that you can add. Let's just quickly check if there are questions. Okay, someone's asking, is Rasa open to all common transformer packages? Because you're using the word all, I'm inclined to say no, just to be on the safe side, because it's impossible for me to know all the packages and to know whether or not we are compatible. Check the documentation for that is my best advice. If there's something missing, let me know on Twitter, and I can check whether or not we can add something experimental as well. Can stories be reused in other stories? Yes, we have a checkpointing mechanism. Be a little bit careful though, because you want to use it sparingly for reasons like you can use a sub story, but most of the time that you want to use a sub story, that's really a form. Like that's the main reason, and a form is not necessarily the same as a story. So there's some subtle differences there. Like the main reason why you want to have a sub story is usually the form aspect. But it's better to think about that as a form as opposed to a part of a story sometimes. How do you save data for upcoming intents in stories that you might need for later stages? So if you're using Rasa X, there's actually a button that you can click if you're doing this locally. If you're hosting this on a server, there's also a link that you can make with GitHub. So that means that you can say if you've labeled something, you just deploy to GitHub with new labels and you update your system that way. Anyway, what I think I want to do with this group first, and again, let me just quickly check the time. I think I've got like a good 40 minutes left still. So the first thing that I would like to do is answer the question about like, hey, how can we customize what we're doing? Which means that we will be making a custom action, because that will include things like domain knowledge. Because the idea is that, let me just draw that out real quick. Let's say that this is Rasa, right? This is our Rasa service, so to say. Well, then, if you think about it, sometimes you are going to need a database, which could be things like weather predictions. If a user says, hey, give me the latest weather prediction, that is something that you typically need to get from a third party or from your own database. So what you would then need to do is you would need to connect to some sort of service that can actually talk to this database. But communicating with a database that is, if you think about it, such a separate concern from handling the conversation and doing all the machine learning. So what we typically do is we say, well, let's just, if these were Docker containers, let's just split them up. And let's just say that this is our action service. And what we can do is we can kind of have basically custom Python functions in here, like almost like a Lambda architecture, you could say. And then what we can do is we can say, well, let's configure our Rasa service in such a way that it can find all of these separate actions and functions. And then that way it can also get responses back that it can then serve to our end users. That's sort of the architecture diagram that Rasa likes to use for this. This is also kind of nice if you're running on Kubernetes, because you could say something like, well, I want to have like one container of this, but because some of the actions are compute heavy, I want to scale these actions independently of Rasa. Like you can do that. But this is, to put it lightly, this is the architecture diagram of what we're going to do. So what I'm going to do now is just implement a fairly simple custom action over here. And I think as a basic example, what might be fun is just like, let's ask the assistant what the current time is. I think that might be like a fun little example. And we could do that with Python code. Like we can call the date time functionality of Python to tell us what the current date time is. So that's something I will live code now together with you. So to do that, we need to write some custom Python code. If you have a look at the project, like the blank slate document that I have over here, the place where you want to add such a Python file is here, like in this actions folder. And in this actions folder, you will find the aptly named actions.py file. And this is going to be the file that we'll be editing. So again, where can you find this actions.py file? In the root folder, there's a folder called actions. And inside of that is a folder called actions.py. And that's where we'll be editing. move that away. Let's make this a little bit smaller now as well. And we have our actions.py file, and there's a base template, but it's commented out. So let's just select all of that, uncomment it, and then we will make some changes to it. And let's also remove the comments at the top there. Okay, so there's a few things to point out. For starters, I am totally inheriting here. Let's use the other cursor. But I'm inheriting a couple of base classes from this project called Rasa _SDK. Now note, that's not something you have to install separately, but it is a separate Python package for all intents and technical purposes. But if you install Rasa, you should also have the SDK installed. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a custom action. And a custom action is implemented as a class, but it does need to inherit from this action class that we import here. Again, all of this is pre-configured and written down for you, so you can just copy it, but it's good to be aware of that. But an action in general needs two properties as far as Rasa is concerned. The first thing that it needs to have an implementation for this name. And the idea is that the name that we have here, that is something that we can use in reference in our stories file, in our domain file. And without a name, we won't have the Lego brick that we can place elsewhere. So one of the things that we will need to do is come up with a very good name. Now, the naming scheme does tell us that it's best to just keep the word action intact here. But what I am going to go ahead and do now is I'm just going to call this action give time. I think that's a more appropriate name of the action that I have in mind. And I will also call this action give time. So okay, we've got the name and we've got the inheritance stuff, right? So that's already quite convenient. And then everything else that we need to do as far as like implementation goes happens inside of this run function. So this run method is the thing that will actually get triggered the moment that this action in our story is triggered. But this is Python, so we can basically do whatever we like. A couple of things are being passed in. We've got our domain that is passed in, but also we've got a dispatcher, and the dispatcher is basically a class that allows us to utter messages, so to say. But we've also got a tracker, and the tracker allows us to do things like, hey, give me this, I don't know, give me what the user said right now. Give me the probabilities of the intents for the previous utterance, etc. Also, things like long-term slots, which we'll see in a moment, can be retrieved from this tracker over here. Now, though, let's keep things simple. So from datetime, import datetime, import datetime as DT. And then what I should be able to do here is something like just an f string dt.datetime.now. Just very, very basic. We could be doing all sorts of fancy things here with communicating to databases, but just to keep it simple, I can say something like, hey, let's give the user the current date time stamp. And again, I'm using a fancy f string inside of these curly brackets here. And I'm using the datetime module to tell me what time it is right now. So, okay, as far as functionality goes, I think this is pretty good. What we now got to do is think about where we are going to be placing all of this, because we now have this new action. And in order to trigger that action, I will also need an intent. So that means I will need to make a change to my NLU.yaml file over here. So I'll go down all the way at the bottom here, add an extra intent. Let's ask for the time. I think that's a pretty okay name for an intent. And one thing to pay attention to, it is important that you don't forget about this bar over here. So I'll be giving lots of examples as a text here, which is why we need this bar. If you want to make sure you copy it the right way, just feel free to just copy it explicitly like so. There we go. And then we can say something like, give me the time. Please give time. What time is it? Tell me the time. Could you let me know the hour? Well, some examples, I guess. Um, Definitely not a perfect list of all the examples we could come up with this intent, but it's at least a list, and I think this should cover enough ground for as far as we're concerned. So we've got our intent over here. Probably the next thing to do is to let's just copy this action over here and let's just add that to a story somewhere. So let's add one here. So when we have the intent of ask for the time, then we have an action that says, let's give the time. Like we need a example in a story, I suppose. But then again, like it probably can't hurt to have a rule now that I think of it. Give the time rule. That would also be like a thing to do. So again, I have an intent, and this is the action that you should have afterwards. And I think we can also have that as a rule. Can't hurt now that I think of it. If you don't do this, though, it should also just work, but I think that this is fine. So far, so good. Again, to recap all the things that I've done so far, if I started out with this actions.py file, I have this custom action over here, and I have a name, and it's doing something. It's got the logic implemented that I wanted to. The next thing that I need is I need to have this action being used in this story. All right, so we've got our action over here, but it means that we also need to have an intent that can trigger it. So, okay, I'm using the action and this intent in my stories and in my rules, but I will also need examples for that intent, which is what I've added here. And we're almost done with this implementation. There's just two things we still have to do. The first thing that we have to do is we have to go to our domain.yaml file, because all the actions that we sort of come up with also need to be defined there. So action give time also needs to be listed in this list of actions that we have here in our domain.yaml file. So you should, and if you don't see actions, it might be that you don't see this if you didn't run the Rasa interactive command that I ran earlier. But just know that the only thing we need is something that looks like this. So actions, little bar, space, and an action give time. Like that's the one thing that you need. I'm going to add this because it doesn't hurt anybody, but the main thing you want to make sure of is that this is added. Okay. So this is everything I think we need to actually add our own custom action. In this case, though, one command that's pretty useful is we can run Rasa data validate. And what this will do is this is just the sort of a linter command that will just check all of the files that we have to see if we maybe made a spelling error. I think, from eyeballing it, I think we did all right. But this is always a command that's good to just run before you actually hit the big train command. Okay, so it's saying that there's an error. Project validated completed with errors. Let's just have a look. Yeah. Ask time in stories is not part of the domain. Yes. Okay, so this is good. We forgot about something. The domain file doesn't just need to have access to all of our actions. It also needs to have the full list of all of our intents. Yes. So I forgot about that. We also need to have this intent ask time be listed here. And again, it's saying use entities because I used the interactive command. Don't worry. Yeah, so I should explain it. Don't worry about these use entities true if you don't have them. This is something that has been automatically added by the Rasa interactive tool that I've used. The main thing that it's complaining about below here is that this ask time intent that we define in our NLU.yaml, Before, it was being used in a story, but it wasn't defined here. And Rasa really likes all of the intents to be defined in this file if you're going to be using them in stories or in rules. So I'll run the validate command again. I think this is the main thing that it is complaining about. The rest were just simple errors, I think. Okay, so this ran fine. Everything now should work. So the only thing that needs to happen is, because we added a new intent, the Rasa model needs to retrain. So I'm going to run the Rasa train command right now, and after this, we should see we should be able to have a conversation, and we should have our lovely little custom action run on our behalf. Yep. Okay. So I have there's someone with a great question. Really good question, actually, which is kind of a philosophical one, but well spotted. Some of you might have noticed that for saying hello, there's an example that says good afternoon. And, I can definitely say that if I say good afternoon, that could mean that we are greeting. However, if this is being used at the end of the conversation, then good afternoon, can also mean goodbye. And you might wonder, well, this is going to be tricky because we've got two intents using the same example, and that could be confusing. And Dave, you would be correct in this. So the intent prediction model would have trouble with this example. However, in Rasa, we have this model that can take text, and we call it the NLU model. And it can produce an intent. It's a prediction. But we still have another model. Let's call that the policy model. Sort of box around it to indicate that this is a model. But we've got this policy model that takes the predicted intent to predict the next action. However, we don't just take the current intent that's predicted. We also put information from the conversation so far in there. And that's the crucial thing. In order to figure out whether or not good afternoon is meant as a hello or a goodbye, we kind of need to know if this happened in the beginning of the conversation or at the end of it. And this is also what I would argue probably the harder part of doing conversational assistance well, as far as machine learning is concerned, than just intent prediction. You'll find lots of interesting and often meaningful articles where people are trying to benchmark their intent prediction task, which is all well and good, but intents on their own are just a limited scope of what's happening. You also need the context of the conversation so far to come to a really good action prediction. So in Rasa, we have a separate system for that as well. But you are correct. Like these are tricky examples, and you should definitely think about them. So it's a good observation. Let me just check for some other questions. There are some friendly applications that allow you to create a chatbot easily. I think it's fair to say that yes, this is not a click and drag tool, Rasa. It's not. But we'll see in a moment that there's flexibility here that a simple click and drag tool won't be able to offer you. Although I hope it's also clear that if you have a look at this custom action over here, you have the full flexibility at your disposal here to do anything that Python can do. So if you had a very fancy machine learning model and the output of that you would like to use here, you're completely free to do so. And any sort of properly customizable system, is not going to be click and drag anytime soon. So sure, you might be able to do something relatively quickly with a click and drag tool, but the ability to customize, I would argue here, is the main reason why I'm interested in making this in Rasa. So I think I've answered most of the questions here. As far as I understood, you show a wheel in a command control paradigm. Not for complex flows at constant conversation. I just answered that question. So what I now want to do is just give you the demo that this indeed all works. But before we can do that, there's one thing that we should be aware of, which is something I mentioned earlier. And that is, of course, that we have these two separate services. We've got our Rasa service, And we've got our action service. And if you want Rasa to talk to the action service, it needs to be running as a separate process. So, okay, the first thing that we need to do then is tell Rasa where it can find the custom action, which we will do here in the endpoints.yaml file. The main thing that you'll want to uncomment is this guy, action endpoint. It's a URL that we need to uncomment. But this configuration at endpoints.yaml, that is going to tell Rasa where exactly it can find the action server. And then the next thing that we should do is we should actually run it. So if you're in Visual Studio Code, that's relatively easy. There's a button here that allows you to have two separate shells. And what you can do here is you can say Rasa run actions, and this will automatically pick up the actions.py file over here and run this action. So I'll just run that. And on this one, we can just run the Rasa shell. And because we've got this endpoints configured, the Rasa shell should be able to communicate with the action server over here. Okay, so just to give it a demo, just type hello. And if I now type give time, we see that indeed we do get a proper timestamp, which we're not logging anything here, but you can definitely say like, yes, that is something that has been generated by this custom action over here. So anything that you can come up with that you can do in Python that you want to send back to the user, you can totally do that. So note that you can also send images here. So if you want to generate a QR code, you can totally do that. But that's great about these actions. You can do anything that Python can do from here. There's a couple of questions that came in. I'll just briefly answer real quick. Is it possible to use infos about the user's position, for example? So things like time zone in order to say good evening instead of good morning. That depends a little. So the thing is, you would need to have that information yourself. So you have to imagine, let's say we hook this up to WhatsApp. WhatsApp is not going to give us the information from the user, right? So it would be a violation of privacy if WhatsApp would tell us, oh, this user is currently located at this latitude, longitude. So let's say, for example, in this particular case, that we have a user that's using your service and we have a database that has that information about that user. Then what you can imagine in this function, the first thing that we will do is we will ask, where is a certain user? We can ask, and then we get back, oh, the user is in, I don't know, Amsterdam, let's say. And then we can write the custom code that said, okay, given that this person is now in Amsterdam and we have the action say hello, goodbye, or afternoon, then we can write the logic to handle that. Again, the main thing that's important is this user logged in and do we have that information readily available? Because I can't imagine that WhatsApp will give you this information, to be honest. There's also someone asking about multiple fallback messages. Yes, all of that is configurable. It's a little bit outside of the scope of this workshop, but I can show you some videos I made on YouTube that explain this in more detail. But definitely Rasa has many different options for fallback because it's an important topic when you're making assistance. Okay, grand. Let's just check the time real quick. Okay, so I have about 15 minutes left, which isn't a whole lot, but I can still do like one extra little demo, I think. Yeah, so what I think I will do just as a demo to show, if people don't mind. So I could live code this, but I think we might be a little bit short on time. So what I'm just going to go ahead and do is people were asking about slot values as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy and paste some code into this project that will ask a user for their first and their last name. Just because I think that's a pretty neat demo. And then we can also see that this is information that's stored in the conversation for a longer term. So we might be able to imagine what else we could do with that. I will, however, copy some things from my validation let's just do the simple form one. I think that will be good enough. And then in this domain file, I have a simple form definition. Yes. And the slots, those are the things that I need. Yep. So, okay, that should be it. Let's go to our domain.yaml file. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a form. Real quick. Yes. And slots, I think, is defined there already. So let's remove that. Yes. And probably forms is defined someplace else already. So let's remove that. Okay. So what I've got now in my domain.yaml is I've gotten a... I have two things defined now. One thing that I've defined is the name form in this form header over here. And the idea is that this is just the name of a form, and inside of that are the things that I'm interested in asking. So for example, I would like to know the first name and the last name of the user. This is something I can ask for. And let's also say this is something that I'm asking that I can just grab directly from the text. So I'm assuming that the user will just directly type their name in. Then the idea behind the form is that we ask the user for this information, but then also that we save this for the long term, that as long as the conversation takes, we're not forgetting what the user's name is. So for that, we also need to have these slots, which you can imagine to be like memory addresses, if you will. So we have something of a first name that's a text thing. And, you know, this influence conversation is not terribly important, but it will influence the policy mechanism. But the idea is that we have a first name, it is text, and it is something that we're asking for in this name form over here. So as far as the domain.yaml file is concerned, that's now configured. There's information that we can ask for. The next thing that I got to do is go to my rules. And let's copy that in. My rules.yaml file over here. There we go. And to be able to handle a form, we are going to introduce some rules to help us. Because if you think about what a form should do, is you could say, well, a form that's kind of like a set of values that need to be filled in. And whenever there's a value missing, the user can tell us a value, but then we have to validate if that value is correct before moving on to the next form value to fill in. So it's kind of like a loop. And we kind of would like to have a rule that just says, you know, if this intent happens, then start the loop. And only when all the form values are filled in, then stop the loop. You can read all about the details of this in our documentation pages. But the idea is that we just have this moment where we activate the form. And there's this moment where we can recognize that all the values that we need are passed in, and then we can deactivate the form. By the way, everything that I'm copying and pasting here, there is a GitHub repo that will also get some tutorial videos live next week. So if people would like to do this more slowly, ping me afterwards and I'll show you all the educational content on this. I think we are nearly done. The main thing that I need to do is just make sure that we've got this intent here for the form as well. So request names is an intent now. There's some examples. So let's just be a little bit quick and dirty here. Say, please give me, let's say, give name. I want to tell you my name. You need to know my name. Give name, give name. Spelling error. Okay, something like this. So let's make sure that this intent is also in our domain as an intent. We need to make sure that that's in there like before. And I guess the final thing that we should still have is that this action this name form, that's also an action that needs to be in our action list. Okay. If everything went well here, Rasa data validate. We should be able to see that indeed nothing went wrong. Oh, right, there's a bunch of stuff. Okay, there's a bunch of things I gotta fix, but what I'm going to do, again, in the interest of time, is I'm just going to show you just the results from this project, just because it's easier. Simple form, there we go. Whoops. No. Back to the terminal. Sorry. Okay, simple form. If I type Rasa shell with the forms activated like I just showed you, it's tracker. I'm just answering my question. It's live. Tracker get slot from the top of my head. Like that. Please check the docs, just to be sure. Okay, let's try this. I can say hi. It says, hey, how are you? If I say give name now, it asks what is my first name, Vincent. I will also give my second name. And we can now see that indeed it has remembered that my name is Vincent. So this is something that it's stored for a longer period of time over the conversation. And just to give an impression of what else you can do, if I just go to this other project, 05 validation, if I do Rasa shell here, what you can also do with these forms is you can attach a custom action to the form, which is interesting. And that can be a custom action that can validate the form. So you can do things like, hey, the user just gave it the first name, but is the first name spelled correctly? So if I were to do something like, hey, give name here, clear, restart. Yes. If I type hello, it says, hey, how are you? If I then say, hey, let's give you my name. It's messed up, but okay. In the interest of time, I have to switch to a final topic, but you can also add validation to a form. Now, the main thing that I do want to end on, because I've shown you lots of the features, and there's definitely more you can do with Rasa, but I only have so much time, and it is also a little bit unfortunate that I cannot get the live feedback from the audience here. That's the downside of doing workshops nowadays, I guess. But the one thing I do want to emphasize and point out, which is important, is that, if you're making an assistant in English, you are definitely kind of blessed, because English is a relatively easy language for algorithms. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it. There tends to be a little bit more research. Morphologically, English is an easier language. But, maybe you have a customer base that's not just about English, but also about Dutch and Spanish. And, maybe you also have customers in Senegal. The whole idea behind Rasa is that because it's open source, we can use a community of people to sort of help along and code along with us. So if you're interested in helping out with this, or if you have a use case where you want to go beyond just English, there's a repository that I would like to point your attention to, which is this Rasa NLU examples repository. It's a repository that I maintain on behalf of Rasa. It's not something that we fully support, but it is something that I maintain. And the idea is that this is my place where I can add all sorts of features that are specific to a language to help you out. So if you're building a machine learning pipeline and you're missing a couple of tools for your language, then this is the place where I'm going to try to add support for your language. We have a tokenizer for Thai. We've got tokenizers for, I think, 100 languages via the Stanza project. I've got word embeddings in about 275 languages, if you think those might be useful. We have specialized fallback detectors. The idea is that we might be able to detect that your user is talking in a language that the assistant cannot handle. So that's something that we can help you with. That's something we can automatically trigger. But all sorts of experimental tools that might help you there can be found in this and a new examples repository. And the reason why I want to mention that at the very end, again, is because this is a demonstration why I think it makes sense to use open source tools for a virtual assistant. You will hit this glass ceiling sometimes, and the only way to escape that is to solve it for yourself. If you want to connect to a special database, if you want to make sure that no data is shared with a third party, or if you have to deal with these language situations, then you need something that's open source so you can customize properly. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that before this workshop is done. That said, I hope this was educational. Definitely with the forums that I mentioned at the end. If that's interesting, you want to go into depth more, I have a GitHub repository with like 6 forum examples, so I hope that's going to be good enough. I will be around at the conference for a while, so feel free to send me a message. Until then, though, I hope that this was educational and useful for you. Any questions that you might ask in the channel here, I'll try to answer. Thanks for listening.